Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko says his military will begin a rotational mobilization of selected units, quote, to prepare for war, raising fresh questions about whether Minsk is genuinely escalating or once again signaling loyalty to the Kremlin. This announcement comes as Russian drones increasingly exploit Belarusian airspace, and Ukraine warns of unusual activity near the northern border. Joining us today on TVP World to assess how serious this development is and what it means for regional security is Kamil Kłysiński, Senior Fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
So when we look at this announcement, how serious should this last mobilization announcement of Alexander Lukashenko be taken?
If we would like to assess any statements from Alexander Lukashenko, which are coming not first time, this is not first time when we can hear this kind of statement, we shouldn't forget about two things. One thing, this is co-aggression, status of co-aggressor. Belarus still is a co-aggressor against Ukraine together with Russia. This alliance between Minsk and Moscow is very close, but this is not equal alliance. Minsk, of course, is smaller, younger partner, younger brother. This big brother is in Moscow, and a younger brother in Minsk has to follow objectives and priorities of Moscow. And one of those priorities is to keep this level of readiness in a military area that the Belarusian army, by the way, quite weak army, not very well prepared to any attack, but officially this army should be ready, should be on standby and ready to oppose against any potential, I would stress, very potential, it exists only in Belarusian and Russian propaganda, aggression from NATO, from Poland, mostly Lithuania and Latvia, and other maybe hostile, looking from points of view of Minsk countries. This is one thing. Second thing, this is more internal. This is a totalitarian model of power in Belarus, or at least half totalitarian, because it's still evolving from authoritarian to a totalitarian model. And Lukashenko needs this mood of mobilization, this needs of readiness, of unity of society, army, nomenclatura, whole state apparatus. That's why he announces this kind of steps, this kind of mobilization from time to time. As I said, this is not first statement in this shape, in this regard, which we can hear from Minsk.
All right. Now, when we look at this announcement, do you think that this will actually translate to any sort of meaningful buildup? Like I mentioned, this is mostly because Belarus being Russia's junior partner, it is something that they cannot avoid doing if that is the shots are being called by Moscow. But do you think from a Minsk perspective, they're doing this more for a show to signal to Moscow, or is there anything substantial, and are they presenting a joint front to signal to the rest of the world?
No, I think that this is mostly signal. This is internal signal, as I said, directed to society, that we have to be ready. That me as a president, now I try to reconstruct perspective of Lukashenko, your leader. I am only one effective guarantor of security, independence of the country. That's why our army, our administration should be subordinated towards me and loyal. And second signal is, of course, addressed to Moscow. But this is not real readiness, real preparation to war. Belarusian society is very pacifistic. It's different from Russian society. I always try to explain that we shouldn't equal everything and compare everything one-to-one between Belarus and Russia. Those countries are different, especially societies are different. Also, nomenclatura and Belarusian officers are not eager to fight. Of course, being under huge pressure from Kremlin, which we cannot observe in this subject, in this issue, Lukashenko will send his army towards Ukraine, but without this pressure on his own, he will never decide about it, because it could mean the end of his power, of his model in Belarus.
You mentioned something very interesting there, and I think it will be really great if you can help us elaborate. You mentioned how the Belarusian society fundamentally is quite different from that of the Russian one. Can you help us kind of unpack that statement and what kind of difference are we talking, how different it is?
I think that it becomes quite obvious when you look at map and we know something about history of those countries. Belarus is quite small country. This is less than 10 million of people. In the past, they didn't have any momentum of imperialistic ideology, especially in this kind which we can observe in this shape which we can observe in Russia. They are defensive, pacifistic. This is in the historical memory, in identity of the society. I mean, Belarusian society is survival. In identity of Russian society is a conquer, is expansion, because this is an imperialistic society. So quite different perspectives. As they would like to survive, so they are not ready for expansion, for attack. But of course, they have to be loyal to Moscow. So Lukashenko cannot say officially that no, I'm not going to cooperate. That's why he gives this kind of statements to avoid a direct involvement in this war. He still thinks that this kind of statements and visibility of readiness of Belarusian army will be enough for Moscow. So far, so good.
All right, so given these differences, do you think that there is still any sort of chance where the Western society can bring Belarus under its fold? Because recently we saw foreign ministers of the Nordic Baltic 8 saying that as long as Belarus is so attached with Russia, it will remain frozen, the relations with it will remain frozen. But do you think the West have any sort of leverage to play when it comes to changing Belarus's behavior beyond just sanctions and isolation politics?
I am in this camp of experts who are skeptical about Lukashenko as a negotiator, as a partner. I think that we cannot rely on him anymore. He is too much tied to Russia, too much dominated by Russia, and too much traumatized by his so-called experiences from former dialogue, past dialogue with West. I mean, this period up to 2020, when was forged elections and huge demonstrations on the Russian street. Lukashenko still remembers that dialogue with West was one of factor of that, in his perspective, at least. So Lukashenko is lost as a partner, in my opinion. But we shouldn't think that Belarusian society, Belarusian nation, and Belarus as a country is lost. Never. We should still do as much as we can. We should do our best to preserve support for Belarus as a country and Belarusian society. At this stage, it means lack of real dialogue with official Minsk, with authorities in Minsk, because Lukashenko is in power still. But we should support a society, democratic forces, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya mostly, but also other leaders of opposition, and still remember that Belarus still has own place on map of Europe. It's not lost and shouldn't be another province of Russia.
Right. And speaking of opposition and the Belarusian society, I want to touch a little bit about the Polish-Belarusian journalist Andrzej Poczobut as well, who recently been released from Belarusian prison after a very long, span of negotiations. He says he will be, he intends to return to Grodno. What condition do you think he's likely to face there in terms of civilians or a safety situation? What do you think is going to happen?
As I said, I am quite skeptical about the regime, about perspective of dialogue and cooperation with Lukashenko's regime. After Lukashenko, this is another question, but still he is alive and he's in power. So also I am skeptical about terms which Andrzej Poczobut, privately my good colleague, could find in Grodniecka Oblast, in his homeland. Conditions are very poor. People are, in Belarus are under strict surveillance. Also, activists of Union of Poles, Polish minority organization, where Andrzej Poczobut still is deputy of the head of this organization. Of course, Andrzej is very brave. This is very strong personality. He's very stubborn. I'm afraid that he could come back to Belarus. But I'm really afraid that he can be at least repressed, at least harmed somehow by Belarusian authorities, and as a maximum arrested again, because this is half totalitarian model which is not going to tolerate any strong personalities apart from Alexander Lukashenko.
Right, so we'll have to see how this develops. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.